Hey everyone, Chris here with another filler video, this time detailing a game so obscure that I seriously doubt anyone watching this video will have seen this game before. But feel free to prove me wrong in the comments if you have, with today's game being Rnixa's Secret 2. Which yes, the R is silent, and no, there's technically no Rnixa's Secret 1. In fact, because the 2 only appears outside of the game itself, I'm not entirely certain why it's referred to in that manner. My best guess is because the author made a major update at some point, as I've seen screenshots of this game with blue flame effects instead of red flames. Now sure, at first glance, this looks like it might be a mid-90s DOS game running in an SVGA 800x600 256 color video mode, but that's only partly right, because it's actually a Windows game, developed entirely by one Dave Struthers as a teenager, being released back in 2008 when he was 18 years old. Thus, he'd be double that now, at around 36. If he's still around. It's hard to say because his website stopped getting updated after March of 2012, and disappeared off the net a few years later. I even tried looking up details about the guy, but the trail went cold following a move out of state to work somewhere that's now defunct, so I have no idea where he is now or what he's doing. Nevertheless, this is a game I've known about for a long time and have played a handful of times over the years, though I've never sat down long enough with it to beat it because, I'm gonna be frank, it's not a good game. But there's things about this game which are notable, and as we go through what it has on offer, it may become more and more apparent why I wanted to talk about it. But let's start with the basics. When you first boot the game, you put in a file name and then either start a new game or load a saved game. Then you choose your difficulty, easy, normal, or hard, and off you go. Now you play the role of a relatively young phoenix named Rnixa under the tutelage of Master Phoenix Ximon, whose name is not pronounced that way, but I feel if I try to pronounce it right, it's going to come across as a much less appropriate word. In any case, Ximon one day came upon a locket, which when combined with the 8 relics of the world, could rid the world of evil entirely. But there's a problem, as it was those same evil forces which decided to hoard the relics for themselves, and now sought to take the locket as well. Ximon was too old to try and perform this quest herself, so she instead enlists her pupil Rnixa to take on this dangerous quest, locket in tow, not just to rid the world of evil, but to also prove she is ready to become the next Master Phoenix. Now, first thing you're going to notice is that everything in this game is tiny. The player sprite has hardly any size at all, and even some enemies are super small. Now, this was done to facilitate a combination of overhead shooting gameplay with the same sort of environmental puzzle solving and map design as is found in The Legend of Zelda. In fact, Dave even went so far as to indicate on his website that The Legend of Zelda was the key inspiration for this game. The controls are actually pretty simple though. Arrow keys to move, spacebar to glide, and you have 2 methods of attack available to you, using an attack selection key and a firing key, or using 3 different firing keys for the 3 different weapons that you get across the course of the game. Long-range missiles, short-range missiles, and bouncing missiles. One trick with the controls, though, is that they not only produce acceleration, but you can't immediately turn around unless you come to a stop. Thus, when you're pressing in one direction and then press an adjacent direction, Rnixa takes a quick moment to turn into that direction while still moving. Now, if you try to do an about face, you'll have to slow down entirely first, and then Rnixa will immediately face the other direction. Well, this only affects movement though, as you'll shoot in whatever direction you're facing in. Diagonally at 45-degree angles if you're not straight vertical or horizontal, otherwise straight vertical or horizontal. You start the game with only the long-range missiles, which have the best rate of fire, but not all enemies are vulnerable to them. You get the second weapon, the short-range missiles, which are actually more like a melee attack, not that far into the game, and these do damage over time, frequently stunning enemies in the process. Plus, enemies which are specifically vulnerable to the short-range missiles tend to drop health crystals when defeated in that manner. The last weapon, bouncing missiles, fires a trio of shots, splitting your attack damage between all 3 shots, but one of the 3 shots doesn't bounce, one of them only bounces once, and the last only bounces twice. While the goal of the game is to collect the 8 relics, similar to the notion of collecting the 8 Triforce fragments in the original Legend of Zelda, there's a few common obstacles you'll be dealing with along the way. Gaps, enemy blocks, bomb blocks, locks, and cannons. Crossing gaps is done by collecting a variety of feathers, with the first feather you acquire allowing you to glide over gaps of 3 tiles in any of the 8 standard directions, and each feather following increases the size of gap you can cross by 1 tile. Enemy blocks are kind of the crux of the game though. As you probably have figured out by now from watching the footage, many screens are freaking loaded with enemies to defeat, but not every screen requires that these enemies be vanquished, unless you see a red enemy block gaining access to something. Then, if you want to get through that block, you've got to kill each and every enemy on the screen. This is definitely one of the less well thought out aspects of the game design, as clearing a single room of enemies more often feels like chopping wood than having any semblance of skill or strategy. Granted, there is some skill and strategy at play, as some enemies do have certain considerations, as some enemies have projectile attacks, some enemies change behaviors under certain conditions, and some enemies are just plain more lethal than others. The other consideration too is that sometimes enemies drop health crystals you can pick up, but enemies can also pick up health crystals to heal themselves. For the most part though, combat is just flat out boring, and it only gets interesting when you're fighting relatively small groups of tougher enemies, or taking on bosses, as the bosses do have an interesting variety of techniques and tactics that they'll use against you. The other common obstacles are much more straightforward. Bomb blocks are similar to enemy blocks, except you bypass them by shooting and detonating all bomb tiles on the screen, if any are present. Locks simply require keys to open, though are often placed in rows of multiple locks one after another, which again feels kind of player hostile. And then cannons are weird in that they point in a particular direction, generally straight up, and if you touch one from any direction other than the direction it's pointing in, it'll fire an explosive that can permanently destroy almost any kind of tile on the map, let's say for steel blocks. What this also means though is that they can destroy your permanent power-ups if you're not careful. Oh yeah, unlike Zelda where you gained health by defeating bosses and powered up your attacks by collecting stronger and stronger swords, here in Rnixa's Secret you collect tiny upgrades to your health and attack power as you make progress. You'll also come across solid yellow blocks with power-ups trapped inside which you can't collect at first, but a means exists later in the game to allow collecting these if you do some backtracking to go back for them. But yeah, so far we've established that the combat isn't all that fun, and the game world can be oppressively large. It doesn't make for the most fun time, especially with barely any sound effects and no music to speak of. But I haven't gotten to the truly unbelievable part yet. See, the game maps your progress as you explore the world, and even up to around the halfway point, you can see that there's a lot of the world I have yet to explore. Now, even though the game isn't designed very well, there's a lot of it. Dave clearly had a passion for the map design aspect of this, given that there's an entire 10x10 overworld, underground, and 8 large dungeons to go with all of this. Not to mention some other secret places too, and for one person to have put all of this together in and of itself is impressive enough. However, a little past the halfway point, the volcano erupts, and this drastically changes all of the overworld, some of the underground, and some of the dungeons. And to be able to have done that effectively means having to have created all of the maps to begin with, then taking those maps and creating new maps with major changes strewn throughout. And if that's not already an absurd amount of map design for one person to tackle, guess what? You may have been wondering up to now what difference the easy, normal, and hard difficulty selections do. Well, almost nothing. Except load entirely different maps and even different story progression for all locations in the game. Dave effectively created 6 10x10 overworlds, 6 10x10 undergrounds, and a ludicrous number of huge dungeons to accommodate all of that. And that's part of what originally drew me to this game, despite it not being that good, is the fact that the sheer quantity of mapping effort it took is freaking inspiring. Sure, there's no stores to buy items to use, there's not really any items to speak of either, the glide mechanic can be finicky, there's far too many enemies, the combat isn't fun, and heck, it even locks up every once in a while, meaning you need to remember to save frequently. but the amount of game here is beyond impressive given what this is, and given that this was Dave's 9th freeware title. Yeah, he was numbering his game releases on his website, much like how I've been numbering all of my videos. All of that said though, the map design isn't amazing either. There's a frequent overuse of mazes, especially on the higher difficulty maps, and some of the glide puzzles have loopholes to them, which, when exploited, can actually get you soft-locked if you end up dying and having to respawn. Not helped by some glide puzzles intentionally requiring you to abuse what would otherwise be loopholes to succeed. That's actually one of the key problems with trying to do too much level design too quickly, is you're gonna overlook things. And there's a lot of overlooking in these maps, which you have to watch out for. My general rule of thumb is to only use keys you are able to get in obvious ways. If a key wasn't obtained in an obvious way, hold off on using it if you can. In any case, if you want to try it out today, I highly recommend you don't run it straight and put DX Wind in your chain. While it technically does work straight, modern Windows isn't so kind with resolution changes, as the game normally only runs full screen at 800 by 600 resolution. So DX Wind will let you put that into a window, plus you can then size the window differently and have some extra filtering in place to improve the visual fidelity. That said, it's incredibly straightforward to set up in DX Wind, though I will say, make sure you turn on the clipper functionality, and also there's pros and cons to forcing vertical sync, as if you force it on, the game speed will be more stable between screen transitions, but the frame rate will also tend to skip more, whereas leaving vertical sync off will result in a more stable frame rate, contrary to what you would expect, but it also causes some extreme speed following some screen transitions for a split second. Since Dave's website is now long gone, save for what can be dug out of web archives, the place I would recommend grabbing a copy from is the Allegro.cc website, as it is indeed a game made with the Allegro game programming libraries, much like my old games from the 2000s were. Heck, that's how I learned about this one, and you'll see one of the reviews for the game on the Allegro.cc website is a review from myself from many years ago. So yeah, Rnixa's Secret, a Zelda-style game seemingly lost to time that's both incredibly bland but incredibly large, and one I find inspiring despite its overall quality being subpar, simply because of the passion it took for one person to craft 3 massive game worlds to go with it. Heck, playing this game again is kind of making me want to go back to some of my own similar ideas to see if maybe I could make one of them alongside my current main project, just as something to do when the main project has me in a rut with something tricky. I don't know, we'll see about that. There's pros and cons to trying to juggle more than one game dev project at a time as an indie, especially when your main job is making online videos every week, so no promises. Anyways, that's all for this filler. Stay tuned for the next episode of Ancient DOS Games, episode 358, debuting 2 Saturdays from now on June 27th, where we're going to take a look at one of the few graphic adventure titles out there based on a classic story from olden times. So make sure to stay tuned to see which such story got such a modern treatment. Well, modern for the early 90s anyways. Thanks for watching, and extra special thanks to everyone pledging support over on Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you too can see yourself here and help keep the show going, so please consider joining over at patreon.com/KASICK.